In this week's session, we are going to complete the discussion on the economic significance of sport, which we began in first week's sessions, and this is going to include concluding some discussion of which parts of the sport industry are most significant in economic terms, so which generate the most income and expenditure in the economy. And what this will allow us to do then is, in the second and third parts of today's lectures and screencasts, we will be looking at models of the sport industry and talking about how the model is hierarchical and how an understanding of this allows us to understand how money flows around the sport economy, and how producers and households interact within the sport economy. And this will then lead us on to, finally, in the third and fourth parts of the screencasts this week, some discussion of the nature of sport as a consumption good. It has some peculiar properties, and this creates some issues for consumers about making rational decisions about whether to engage in the sports market, whether to buy sports products. And this in turn creates issues in the supply side of the market for suppliers, and particularly government, and whether government should become involved in the sports market to make sure that consumers engage in sport in meaningful ways. So, Screencast 1 then is going to conclude the discussion that we started in last week's session, which was looking and reviewing at some evidence on the economic significance of sport. And the data that we were looking at last week was for the 2012-13 financial year, and in the UK. And the article that we were looking at last week, just to refresh our memory, is that sport-related consumer spending grew faster in the period 2010 to 2013 than household spending, which is all consumer spending, and gross domestic product, which we said is a measure of the economic activity within the whole economy. So what we can see is that in the period 2010 to 2013, that the sport economy had outperformed the rest of the economy. And one of the other things, if you read the article, and that we did mention briefly in the lecture last week, is that previously, in previous economic cycle patterns, if the economy itself, so if GDP had grown at less than 2%, then the sport economy didn't grow. It actually shrank. So it wasn't enough just for GDP to be growing. It had to be growing at a level of above 2% for the sport economy to grow. Now, if we look at the years 2010 to 2013, although overall the average is 3%, some years within those 2010 to 2013 years, the economy was growing by less than 2%. But the sport economy, sport-related consumer expenditure, was still growing. So we kind of said, well, is this an Olympic effect? So did interest in the Olympics lead to increased activity in the sport economy? We also discussed how this could represent a shift in taste and preferences. Now, this could be because of a general increasing awareness of the benefits of exercise and sport to health, and people incorporating this into their lifestyle. And it could be a combination of that with the Olympic effect, so inspiration that's provided by the Olympic Games and increased interest in sport in general. Those are things which we will consider later in the module, but it's just worth thinking about those things here and now. Now, the other thing that in some groups I did manage to speak to you about, but in other groups we didn't manage to speak to you about, is this table, which asks us where is growth over the period 2010 to 2013 coming from. We know that the sport economy overall is growing, but as I've said to you previously, demand for sport is volatile, and volatility means that although generally over the longer time demand for sport increases, this can mask areas of rapid increase and rapid decline. And we talked about in participation sport how team sports and demand for those, as evidenced by participation rates, had struggled. It's been declining in many team sports for 15 to 20 years. And we can see that pattern quite clearly in a number of sports. But this is being replaced by very strong growth in the health and fitness sector, in cycling, mountain biking, running, and these are more solo, informal sports. So we talked about that. So it's interesting to look at where growth in the sport economy is coming from. And to some of you, we did talk about participation sport, and the growth in participation sport is the largest area of growth here, very substantial. And we said that sometimes that's surprising to some people outside of the sport industry, because the thing that gets the high profile and the media attention is the elite sport, the Olympics, the Premier League, the televised sport, which has got a high media profile. And some people tend to think when you talk about the sport industry, that's what you're talking about. But what we can see here is that participation sport and health and fitness are both big areas. If we combine those, they're big areas. And what we also said is that, and we will talk about this when we talk about demand and understanding demand and determinants of demand, that participation sport and health and fitness, which is kind of gyms and training in gyms, they can be seen as the parent demand of clothing sales and footwear sales and sports goods, in that if demand in participation increases and demand for health and fitness clubs increases, this will, to a large extent, not entirely because of athleisure and wearing sports clothes and shoes as general leisure wear rather than purely for sporting purposes, but a large proportion of growth here will drive growth in these areas too, which also saw a strong growth as well. So it's interesting, to look at this. And also the period 2010 to 2013, what the author of the article, which is linked here, actually says is that the growth in admissions over this period, a lot of this can be attributed to the Olympic Games as well, which shows the importance of events in the sport economy. Now, one of the things that occurred to me, or that emerged as I've done a bit more reading in preparation for the session this week, is that in lectures last week I told you that the last data that was available was for 2012-2013, which is the last year that the Sport Industry Research Centre produced the sport market forecasts, which included an assessment of the size of the sport economy. Now, slightly to my embarrassment, but I'm also going to defend myself because this was only published kind of last month, really, August 2020. The Sport Industry Research Centre at Sheffield Hallam University has concluded some research for Sport England based on the 2017 to 2018 sectoral economy data, but published in August 2020. Now, this data, it's worth noting, is for England only. The previous data that we looked at on previous slides was for the whole of the UK, but this work was commissioned by Sport England and therefore looks just at the sport economy in England. But I think in previous slides we could see that in 2013, the whole of the sports economy in the UK, so this is the UK, not just England, was worth £25 billion. And we can see that in England now, it is worth £25 billion, just below the entire UK figure. So if we think that the entire UK population is 65 million, and that the population of England is around 55 million, that shows us that there has been, since 2013, so between the period 2013 and 2017 to 2018, the size of the sport economy is likely to have grown significantly as well. And what we can see here is that there is some change in the way these have been aggregated, but that participation remains a very big part, actually the second biggest category. And what's happened here is that participant sports, subscription and fees, the participation sport figure on the previous slide in the health and fitness data have been rolled together to give us this figure here. And this is only bettered, or is only higher for sports gambling, which, as we can see, has grown fairly significantly, driven really by the growth in online gambling. So we can see that there is some fairly significant growth there. If we look at the gambling figures, which are disaggregated in this slide for off-course and on-course, we can see that there has been some growth, and this is just for England itself. So there's rapid growth in the gambling market, but still, if we look at participation sport as the engine room, and we think about this idea of parent demand and derived demand, here we can see strong evidence for the size of demand and the value of demand in the participant sport and subscription and fees sector of the economy, driving clothing sales, footwear sales, and sports equipment. So what we can see is that, it's still true to say that the participant sector of the industry is the engine room, and that, although there's a lot of money, there's a lot of information talked about the size of the professional sports sector, and particularly the value of the Premier League, that it's still not as big as participant sport. So let's just reflect on this. And I've made these points several times over, so I hope these are fairly clear to you when we talk about these now. And the first is that there is a lot of attention, media attention, and if we stop the reasonably informed man in the street or woman in the street, they could make a fair assumption that the most significant part of the sport industry was that represented by the elite professional level. But actually, it's participation, consumers' own participation in sport rather than as a spectator, which drives a lot of activity in a lot of sport economies around the world. And back to themes I was talking about to you in week 1. This is why I think in Europe, in the UK, and Australia and New Zealand, when we talk about the sport economy and the sport industry, we do include participation. So when we come on to look at supply and demand in the market, we need to understand why governments are interested in promoting participation, why there is a voluntary sector and its role in participation, as well as looking at the commercial sector in terms of professional team sports and global sports brands. So that's different than the American definition, or the way a lot of the American literature looks at the sports market, and that's due to the way that the study of sport economics has evolved in the US compared to a lot of other areas of the globe. But here we can see, that participation is made up of these different sectors or different sports spending areas, and it really is the engine room for the economy. So it is appropriate for us to, in the next few weeks, talk about government involvement in sport, because they are interested in promoting participation for reasons which we mentioned last week, for reasons which we will revisit again at the end of this week's session, and which we will move on to look at in week 3 in much more detail. Okay. Right. So, it's also appropriate at this stage. So we've looked in some detail at the UK economy and the English economy, and there is a hyperlink from these slides which are available on the module Blackboard site in the week 2 folder, but I've also put a link button on this week's workbook through to this report, so you're able to read it in more detail. One of the things to be aware about for this report is if you read the front end of the report, Sport England is responsible for participation sport. So it talks about the economic value of community sport, not the entire market. So when it talks about the value of community sport, it will exclude TV, gambling, and other sectors of the industry. So the figure that you see at the front end of the report, because that is just about community sport, might appear lower than the 25 billion pounds we're talking about here. It's 13 billion pounds for community sport. But if you flick to the tables at the back of the report in the appendices, and this table is on page 26 at the back of the report, you will see that information is included for the entire sports market, because CERC have used the model that they've used for previous studies running up to and including 2012-2013. So they've run the model which looks at all sectors of the economy, and from that they've then derived the community sport figures. So you may read the front end of the report and think, hang on, it's saying that the sport market in England is only worth 13 billion. That is just community sport, and it doesn't include things like gambling, TV and video rental, cable and satellite subscriptions, newspapers, books and magazines, and newspapers and books and magazines are those which are relevant to the sport industry, and travel, which includes travel to take part and spectate at sport. So it excludes a number of things. Okay, so it's now appropriate to kind of say, having looked at the UK and England, let's look at some international comparisons. Now, international comparisons are somewhat fraught with difficulty because many countries haven't completed an economic analysis of the size of their sport industry, and also there are different methodologies, different ways of calculating. So a study which is quite useful, and one that again the Sport Industry Research Centre led on, which shows you the status and the importance and the profile of Hallam University Sport Industry Research Centre in terms of understanding economic impact and the size of sport economies. The fact that they're commissioned by the EU and the European Community to lead this report. And what this report does is it looks at, across all the EU member states, it looks at the size of their sport market. So we're able to look and see, well, is the UK an exception? Is it bigger than the rest than sport economies in other countries in the EU? And this also, there's a commonality of methodology here, so we can be reasonably happy that we are comparing like with like. So the first slide here, and there are only a couple of slides on this, looks at share of sport related employment. And we looked at, in last week's lecture, and in previous slides, how sport-related employment is a measure of economic activity. When we talk about the economy, we talk about the number of jobs that are provided in the economy. We talk about employment rates. And what we can see here is that the UK's employment rate in the sport industries as a share of overall employment is 3.75. So just under 1 in 25 jobs in the UK is in sport-related employment, which is, higher than you might think. And what we can see as well is that, the other big economies in the European community, which are France and Germany, are relatively high, but that Germany also has high levels of employment in the sport sector, and that Austria as well, which is an interesting figure, has the highest share of sport-related employment. Now, some of you might be asking, well, why is this? And this is because, quite simply, I'd ask you this if we were in a face-to-face lecture, see if anyone could think of the reason. The reason for this is the size of the ski industry in Austria. So the ski industry in Austria generates huge amounts of sport-related tourism with people from outside of Austria and inside Austria as well, but largely outside Austria, travelling and spending money in the ski economy, which includes overnight hotel stays, ski hire, lift passes, and areas like that. So in Austria, the share of the market is really high. In Germany, it's also high, and this is driven by a couple of factors. One is the size of the public sector, and the general participation sector in Germany is large, but also Germany has a fairly large manufacturing base in sport, and Adidas is a good example of this. So both Germany and Austria are important figures to help us understand that different economies have different characteristics, and the Austrian one is an interesting example there, that a strong visitor economy related to part of the sport industry generates an awful lot of jobs and economic activity. So what we can see here is that, just as Austria and Germany are towards the top of the sport-related share of economy, of employment in the economy, they're also towards the top of the sport-related GDP table. So we can see that the size of the ski economy in Austria means that, a 25th of the Austrian overall economy is in the sport-related sector. And it's similar in Germany as well. Okay. And we can see here that the UK is the third or fourth largest sport economy in terms of share of GDP in the EU. So those are the things that I really want to draw out from here. What's also interesting to look at is if I asked you to rank these countries in terms of the size of their economies, what we can see is generally the larger economies, so Germany, the UK, France, Italy, and Spain, have got a higher share of sport-related GDP than some of the kind of less economically developed or countries with smaller economies. So typically we think of the new entrants to the EU, the Eastern European countries like Bulgaria, like Lithuania, so a former Soviet country, like Romania. Some of these have got a smaller share of sport-related GDP, which is something that's interesting to reflect on, because what this shows us is there's a strong positive relationship between employment share in sport and GDP. So the more jobs that you have, the higher your share of GDP, yeah, which is fairly clear to say. And that the richer countries tend to have a higher share of sport-related GVA or GDP and employment than poorer countries. So we've looked at, the UK, Germany, Austria, France, Italy to a degree, have a higher share of sport-related GDP and employment than poorer countries, because we can only assume the sport economy in richer countries is more developed than in poorer countries. So what's the summary of this? Well, it's that sport is an important economic factor in EU member states, and it's actually comparable within the EU to if we combined agriculture, forestry and fishing together. It's as significant as those. So it's not just farming and agriculture, it's forestry and fishing together. So it's, it's a big sector, and it's a growing sector. And the other thing is that sport has the economic characteristics of what's called a luxury good. Now, this is a term that we will explore in more detail when we look at demand and determinants of demand for sport. But it's a luxury good with an income elasticity above 1. What does this mean? This means simply that as incomes rise, a luxury good, demand for a luxury good, increases at a faster rate than incomes also increase, right? So what we can see is that wealthier economies in the EU with higher GDPs and higher GDP per head of population have a greater sport industry, a greater sized sport industry. So this implies that sport production and services will grow faster in lower income countries as their economies grow, which also means that across the EU we can expect to see the sport economy continue to grow strongly in the coming years, if the EU experiment of supporting the new entrants to the EU works and their economies are grown and supported by other EU member states. Okay, so that's the end of Screencast 1. And in Screencast, the other thing that I didn't mention is we talked already about the diversity in structural characteristics. So we looked at how in Austria it is the visitor economy driven by the skiing industry, which is really important. And that contrasts to the UK and Germany, where participation sport is also important. But in Germany, there's still a strong manufacturing base related to sport, which generates a higher level of GDP and share of GDP within that country. And the other thing which is interesting to know is that sport in the EU generates lots of jobs. It is a labour intensive industry. And if we look at the figures for employment compared to GDP, we can see that, for example, if we look at the top of the table, that sport-related employment is 5.63% in Austria, and it's 4.12% of GDP. And that pattern is the same across most countries, that the share of employment is higher than contribution to GDP. And so it shows the importance of creating jobs. It also raises the issue that some jobs in the sports sector, in the service sector, are relatively lowly paid compared to other sectors of the economy. So to some degree, the value added in the sport industry is not yet where we might want it to be. So that is the end of Screencast number 1. And in Screencast 2, we're going to look at some models for understanding the sports market.